Just like there. No, I kind of missed the music.
So did I.
That's concerned.
It's kind of up to you. Oh, Aaron's on wings. Aaron, I hope your drive across Canada is it's going well. It's kind of up to you whether we want the music to stay or not. We just had it on in the background as we were waiting for people to log on.
I thought in a minute to be fair. But,
We'll wait till a few questions come in. You're on there, Sam.
Did you watch this?
No. Obviously, I didn't watch it.
I know.
That could be a good one to react to. Aaron, I hope your drive across Canada has gone well. Said it's the last day today. They were changing time zone before they were changing province. That is mental.
How long was it take?
Canada is too big. 20 hours or something?
No, driving.
Yeah.
It's small fry for some of us.
For some of us. Grand tourers. OL wants to know, when bulking, how long should the maintenance phase be at each weight class? So once I get to 96, how long should I maintain before I begin pushing to 102? I'll just turn the music off. It's distracting.
For you. So the maintenance phases kind of depend on a few different things. One, how fat you've gotten. So how much extra fat you've got. If it was a minimal amount of fat, then you can kind of, give it 3 or 4 weeks. How sick are you of bulking? So from the psychological point of view, how much, has force feeding yourself been an issue? So if you've gotten, some people find it very, very difficult to gain weight. Like the initial few weeks are great fun. And then after like 3 or 4 weeks, they're kind of like, oh, this is kind of shit. But some people get on, a ream of like 2 months because they've restricted their calories for so long. So by the time they get to a bulking phase, it's kind of still a novelty. But mostly you want to be looking at like kind of psychological. So, you want to let that rest for a little bit. If it's gotten to a point where it's kind of negatively impacting your mood, you want to give that a few weeks until it returns to normal, so you're ready to go again. You want to just kind of make sure that if you kind of want to assess those fat levels, so if you've gained a reasonable amount of fat and mass along with it, so hopefully, ideally, you'd have ways of tracking that through. So like, it's unlikely you have access to a DEXA, but if you could get that done, that'd be useful. Skin fold calipers work very well. You just need something consistent and the same measurement each time. And so if you've accrued an acceptable amount of fat mass during your bulk, then you can go, okay, this is just okay. I'll take a maintenance for usually about 3 to 4 weeks, maybe a little bit longer, and then decide to go again. It could be a little bit longer than that. You also need to assess how your lifting is feeling. If it is weightlifting, for example, I don't think OL was doing weightlifting, but if it was weightlifting, for example, you just need to assess, how is your training going? How is your weightlifting going? Is your technique changed a lot? Is your mobility messed up a bit? Does your mobility need a little bit of time to catch up? So then you need to assess, how's your mobility feeling during this maintenance phase? And then during this maintenance phase, can you get your mobility back up to a standard where it's good enough for your lifts? And then start to push your weight a little bit again. I remember OL saying he had quite a bit of weight to gain. It was something like 90 to like 109. So it's very, very likely that you will have some issues with mobility and some speed and power issues. So you'll need to check that as well. Is your speed and power still appropriate? Is it still moving quite well? And then you'll just kind of assess all these different variables involved in your training. And then once all of these are at a satisfactory place, then you can kind of proceed again. If any of these have dropped off negatively, you need to use this maintenance time and however long that takes to just assess these and make sure that they are back up to a level that when you go bulking again, you can make sure that they aren't so far in a deficit that it's very, very difficult for those to be covered up. And you don't want to put those variables in a place where you would have to cut weight to rectify your mistakes from an excessive bulk. For example, the mobility one and the fat mass one would be a huge part of that. So your skill development and your psychological developments are okay. They'll go back to normal once you get the maintenance calories at your final weight. But your fat-free mass will have to be, or sorry, not fat-free mass, your fat mass, you'll have to do a cut eventually to get rid of that if you get too much excess of that. And then the mobility one can be very, very difficult and can take quite a long time to rectify if you gain too much weight beyond your ability to kind of remap all that mobility in your brain. So for a lot of people, unless you're phenomenally talented to muscle acquisition, like the American weightlifting team, of course, you're not going to have such a level of muscle mass where it's going to murder your mobility. But some people do experience this, and a lot of people experience this, natural or otherwise, where your power to weight ratio will just kind of be fucked up a little bit and you just gain too much fat, which is obviously linked to mobility in the fat mass one, where you just get to a place where you're just no longer athletic and you need to make sure that you are staying athletic. So you need to be playing the long game with your bulking, especially for weightlifting, a athletic sport.
If you wanted a rule of thumb for that, if you're like field sports athlete, around 14% body fat is probably where you want to get down to before you bulk again. I think for weightlifters, 14 to 18% is probably all right. Most of you are probably sitting around 15 to 20%, you know. So when you do go up, you might have to drop back down, hit, like, depending where you're at in terms of like how much you care about aesthetics of your physique, pick whether that's going to be 15%, 18%, 14%, but just pick that number and stick to it. Once you hit that, like the day you hit 96 kilos is the day you start cutting that fat mass back down. Then once you get to 14%, you go up again. It might take you a number of times going between 96 and 102 or whatever it is, but I would definitely pick that body fat percentage that you're going to work at. So there's obviously all the things like girth retention, mobility, like power to weight ratios, all those things, but also your hormonal system will be much better predisposed to you gaining muscle, gaining strength, improving your motor patterns if you're holding less fat tissue. So fat tissue just fucks with us in a whole number of ways that we don't want to get. So you're doing the right thing going up and using those kind of weight classes as different markers for going up, but I would pick a body fat percentage that you're going to get down to each time before you go back up. And to be honest, I'd say 14% is probably better than most.
DM Hunter 15 asked a relevant question to that. So like, how fat is too fat? For our weightlifters, you can get somewhere in the region of, for male weightlifters, in the region of about 18%. Anything beyond that, and I think you are just too fat, especially for our natural weightlifters, which is basically everyone watching. 18% is just too damn fat. For female weightlifters, it's probably a little bit more than that, depending on your weight class.
Yeah, definitely.
But typically what we do see, though, with female weightlifters is they're a little bit lower than that, because usually it's more of a fact that female weightlifters are just female gym goers in general who take their strength training seriously, usually just end up in better condition and are typically a little bit lower body fat, because they seem to, for some reason, I don't know if it's female athletes respond better to training, or just the particular ones who are involved in the moment across the world, or they just have better discipline, or it's a combination of both of these. There is obviously differences in female physiology, but they seem to be in better condition. So a lot of times you'll see those female athletes between 16 and 18%, even though on average we'll see female athletes a little bit higher, or female or the general population, due to, you know, breast tissue and stuff like that, and differences in hormones. But for most people, if you start seeing 20, you're gone too far. For a person who's reached their final form, their final evolution in terms of your weight class, I'd like to see somewhere around like 14%, maybe 15%.
Yeah.
Anything more than that, and it's kind of like, ooh, it's just a little bit too fat. I would say just you get more out of it for your weight class. It's
important to note as well that like once you stop or start dropping below 12, 11%, you're probably losing out there as well, you know?
Yeah.
Like you're leaving some stuff on the table by being too lean in terms of your recovery. So there is a butter zone there. It's not necessarily just hitting. It's okay. It's back again.
So great question from Anton Lopa. How do you guys feel about loads of complexes and beginner programs over just variations and classic lifts? So if you think about the purpose of complexes and variations, they are to address specific issues that you have as a lifter, or that one of your lifters have. So when you start weightlifting, you don't have any issues. You haven't developed issues. You haven't had time to learn weightlifting, have particular favorable part of a lift and particular weak parts of a lift. All your lift is shit. So when you use a lot of complexes and variations as a beginner athlete, what you typically end up doing is just wasting time letting them develop an athlete. So usually at the weightlifting, and you'll see what, now this is within reason, of course, but if you look at our beginner weightlifting program, it's mostly just snatch, clean and jerk, reasonable weights of front squats. We push the strength to deadlifts a lot in this and accessory work as well. But there's mostly just snatch, clean and jerk. Now there's a difference between, you know, high rep snatches and a little bit of variation. When we're talking about is when you're straying into realms like the clock off complex, you're doing things like 4 or 5 different variations of a clean or a snatch in one aspect, 2 different overhead variations. That's just too far away from the full lift for beginners to develop any kind of familiarity with the lifts. So typically what you'll see is with a lot of things in life and sports is there's kind of a bell curve in relation to an athlete's experience level and then the level of variation of program. So as they get more experience towards the middle for intermediate athletes, we'll see most of the variation and most of the loading of this variation because this is very, very useful for those athletes. And then as we get towards the end on the other side of the curve, then we just see loads of snatch, clean and jerk and some very specific variation that the athlete has picked up along the way that they will favor for their training. Like, for example, Miso will do stuff like his Miso cleans or he's our heaving hang clean complex. And then basically no other variation in his clean and jerk training. Or we'll see Gabriel will do stuff like mostly just clean and jerk 3 times a week and then a little bit of power clean sometimes, but absolutely zero variation in his clean and jerk. And he snatched. He used to do, I think it was literally snatch and power snatch, no hangs, no blocks, towards the last maybe literally 10 years of his training. So variations are for specific issues all the time.
Yeah, I think, so I was talking to an athlete yesterday, he was coming on board for some coaching, and he was saying he hadn't done a full snatch or a full clean and jerk in like 4 months or something because everything he did was in a complex. And people get down this rabbit hole of like, oh, you're building capacity, like every time you do a snatch, do an overhead squat because you're weak overhead, or every time you do a clean, you do a clean pull beforehand because your clean pull is weak. You really do need to be specific with your training. And the people who need to be specific the most are the people who are just learning that movement for the first time due to the fact they've never done the movement. They don't know where they're weak. They don't know where they just need to actually learn that pattern.
It's kind of bothering me that's not there.
Do you want to check our channel?
No,
there's only...
Yeah, I don't know where... I don't know why it's not appearing. Maybe YouTube pages for talking about genetics.
Yeah,
you never know. It normally appears up every time. What the frick?
It'd be great to know if you got a prompt from YouTube to watch this video, or if you were just on our channel and you saw it by accident.
If you're watching, can you just press the like button or something and see if that would make any difference? Because normally it just appears up, even on our own YouTube. It lets people know we are live.
Right. So the next question is from John Burkard. He said, how much overhead squat volume do you typically program? How to tell if overhead strength is a limiting factor for snatch? So for weightlifters on a normal program starting off, they have no overhead squat volume programmed. That variation wouldn't really be something we typically program into any of our weightlifting blocks. In certain cases, the snatch complex where you might have a snatch plus an overhead squat or a snatch balance plus an overhead squat could certainly be used. In those cases, a frequency of about 1 or 2 times a week is about all we would do. And total volume would probably be 5, 6, 7 sets of kind of 2 or 3 reps. So it's never excessive. And the one program where you might see a bit more of it than in other programs will be the weak overhead program. Even in that case, it's not a standalone overhead squat we'd be using. It would be adding in an overhead squat as part of a snatch complex or a push press behind the neck complex or a whatever it is. You know, it's very, very rarely programmed in the same way we program a back squat or a front squat or anything like that. The reasons for that, there's like a few of them. The first and most important reason, though, is if we start fatiguing ourselves with overhead squat. So say if I was doing a 5x5 progression or a 5x3 progression from week to week with an overhead squat, I'm going to really, really sacrifice a lot of my recovery capital that I'll need for the snatch and for the jerk as well. So by building this strength and by pushing my overhead squat, I'm really going to be pulling back from my ability to do my snatches and my jerks during the week, which are the #1 priority. Like your snatch, clean, and jerk are the only things that really matter. So to be sacrificing that with something like an overhead squat doesn't make a lot of sense. Also, the overhead squat is rarely an issue of strength. So you have usually weak shoulders or poor mobility in the shoulders. Neither of those need to be trained with an overhead squat. Something like a strict press behind the neck, push press behind the neck, snatch, balance, SOTS press, all of these things can train that with much less load than you would use for an overhead squat. And the other thing as well is that if I start doing overhead squats, I'm going to be pulling away total time from squatting. So it's just, for multiple reasons, overhead squats aren't really pushed too hard in our programs.
So the other part you said, how do you know if strength is a limiting factor for snatch or overhead strength? If you can't snatch balance at least your best snatch, it's definitely an issue. Preferably you'd be able to do something like 15 kilos more, or maybe like 10% more than your best snatch pretty comfortably. Beyond that, then it's absolutely no use. If it looks like you're weak overhead, if you look unstable, if you feel unstable, then it's very likely an issue. You'll know if it's an issue, and that's kind of an annoying answer, but you'll know if your overhead is an issue. It'll be very, very apparent to you. It'll be like weak legs are an issue. It'll be very, very apparent.
I think definitely 10 to 15% is a number you can kind of stick to for the rest of your training that will work. Okay.
It's not showing that we're, even if you Google, do you do normal settings when you were?
Mm-hmm.
What the fuck? Oh, it's there now.
Is it coming up now?
It's there when you go into the channel.
Let me just 2 seconds. Do you want to answer the next question there?
So, here's a good question, or an interesting question. I know Dara has an opinion of that. Jody G, full stop, says, sup lads, do you guys ever do speed bench with your athletes? And would you recommend speed bench for combat athletes? And if so, at what percentages of 1RM? Also, would you use chains or bands in that situation? So we never do speed bench. So the use of high velocity training in purely powerlifting sports doesn't make any sense, because when you place the powerlifting movements on the force velocity curve at the very top there, squat, bench, and deadlift are high force movements with low velocity. So when you put them up there, they are not really required to use a lot of velocity. They're not heavily reliant on velocity. Now, there's obviously some speed, you can't move them as slow as possible, but using speed isn't really an important factor. Expression of force and expressing as much force as possible. And if you do go too fast, essentially you won't be able to express as much force as possible, which sounds kind of like it doesn't make sense in some regards. So the heavier weights, the speed or velocity aspect doesn't seem to make a huge amount of difference. So training velocity at lighter weights just doesn't seem to make any sense.
Yeah. People get it really mixed up between like power training and velocity or speed benching, you know, because what you'll often find is they'll do like speed benching for 5 reps and they'll do it at some really light weight and they're just looking at how fast the bar moves. Like there's two factors matter in power training. That's the weight that's being moved, so that's the amount of work done, and then how fast that work is being done. So power, the rate at which work is done, if you're doing very little work, so if you're moving 20 kilos, but you're moving it at 5 meters per second, that's much, much less effective than moving 50 kilos at 4 meters per second. So it's a really simple equation. Where people tend to get mixed up is they tend to think that in my sport, I move my arms very quickly. So if I'm a combat athlete and I punch forward really quickly, that my training should then be punching forward really quickly like this. Now, you have to do a strength phase and then some sort of transition phase and a power phase after, right? While people really focus on, they'll buy like a velocity meter for their barbell and they'll say, okay, I'm going to keep it out 2 meters per second and I'm going to progress weight from week to week at 2 meters per second. So if Gerf can move 40 kilos this week at 2 meters per second on a bench press, then he'll go to 42 kilos next week, 45 kilos next week, 45 kilos the week after. And then you'll kind of gradually get this accumulation of volume or accumulation of weight moving that bar at a certain pace. What you need to instead think about is the main limiting factor for power and the main limiting factor for speed is 1 rep max strength. So at anything around 50% of 1 rep max and above, the only thing that matters for speed and power development is 1 rep max strength. So if I have a bench press of 100 kilos, the real thing you're looking at is getting that 1 rep max number up higher. So you're looking at combat athletes in this case, what you would typically do is spend a lot of your time. In our case, we recommend spending 60% of your time in that actual strength development phase. So proper strength programming. You're not looking at throwing a barbell around the place. It's accumulation of volume at relative or at intelligent kind of relative 1RM weights. And then after that, 60% of your time, you go into a power realization phase where you take that newly built strength, that newly built motor pattern, that increase in proprioceptive awareness, and you start to move a barbell faster then. So it's not, people think they want to be moving a barbell faster all the time. You need to build actual strength because that's the main rate limiting factor. And then you need to realize how to use that strength in a quicker or higher velocity or higher output setting. In the case where people want to use chains and bands, to be honest, I've never once seen it. So this is facilitative loading or whatever you want to call it, where as you stand up higher into the squat, it gets more attention. So there's more chain off the ground, so you have more weight. Or obviously, as you stretch a band more, there's more tension in the band. I have never seen a good case for an athlete using chains or bands or any of this kind of variation for the sake of variation stuff. To be honest, the only reason people would ever really use that is if people are struggling to concentrate and they really need to get someone to focus on something. There's very, very niche areas of injury rehab. So if you're restricted in a certain range of motion where you might want to take some of the loading off someone, take, for example, in the bottom of someone's squat, if they have a mechanical issue in, say, an ankle or a knee, and everything below parallel is very, very difficult for them, but they still have a real need to train above parallel, you could do some facilitative stuff where the weight is taken off by some bands as you sit down into the very bottom, and then as you stand back up again, it will get heavier. But to be honest, it's almost useless in every case, bar those very, very small niche applications. Just training with a barbell and plates and sensible progressions and sensible periodization will make you far stronger, far faster, far more powerful and resilient injury than any amount of bands, chains, or shite like that.
I can see how chains might be novel in a hypertrophy context. So if you were doing flat bench or something, and you would just added chains just for a reduction in loading, so you don't have as much pressure. If you're quite advanced, you're quite strong. I can see how the use of chains would be something novel, not something necessary, but something just kind of unique to add a extra level of difficulty, I suppose, to the top of reps without increasing hugely the amount of weight at the top. But other than that, Max Dooley has a good question here. So when Vershansky discusses hard isometric training, he states it's important that the athletes relax after. Do they simply mean go recover, or are they thinking of certain recovery modalities? So when Vershansky talks about this, he literally means that that athlete relaxes immediately. Like, I mean, immediately after the isometric, that athlete lies down on the ground and doesn't move a muscle, just relaxes everything. Like, he literally means verbatim, literally, whoever translated that for you, that you go and do this. Just literally, like, relax every single bit of muscle tissue you can possibly have. So there's a reason for that. So when we think about the best athletes in terms of basically all sports, we think about the fastest amount of contractions. We think about doing them as repeatable as possible. However, we think about the contraction, but we don't always think about what happens after the contraction to facilitate the next contraction to happen, is for the particular muscle group that initiates contraction to relax. And so this is one of the skills elite athletes have, who are some of the fastest and best athletes, is their ability to relax is tantamount or even better than their ability to contract. They can relax faster than they can contract their muscles. And you might think, why is that important? Well, if you think about the space in between each contraction is of 1 finger length of mine, and if this is the length of time it takes, say it's 1 second to, that's not how long it takes, but let's just say it's 1 second to contract a muscle and then 1 second to relax a muscle. The best athletes in the world, for example, can relax their muscles in half a second. So if that reduces the time between contractions, that means we can do more contractions per second. So that means we can do each movement faster. And so they believe that this is a skill that you can train. Inherently, it's an inherent genetic talent. Again, coming back to genetics a lot, but it is a thing that some athletes have inherently, and it's something some people talk about training. You don't see a lot of that anymore. You actually see not a lot of people talk about this anymore, the ability to relax. Great biomechanists would understand this. A lot of professors would understand. Their lectures in muscle physiology or sports physiology, but these are not really the people doing a lot of research in terms of coaching and stuff. So it's not really talked about a lot at the moment. I'm sure it's going to come back around at some stage, like a lot of things do. The Russians would have been a huge fan of this. Obviously, Vershansky would have been like the godfather of plyometric training. And so he would have understand this. And inherently, it's very, very interesting. Gabriel was talking about this only in Romania. So a sports psychologist told him to do this before he goes to bed every night. So Gabriel lies down in the bed, and then for 45 seconds, is it?
30 seconds, as hard as he can.
He contracts every muscle in his body, like from his head to his toes, ass, hands, abs, everything as hard as he can for about 30 seconds, and relaxes, and does this every night. And what this was allowing Gabriel to do was to kind of map up every single muscle fiber in his body as hard as he can. And he still does it to this day, he says, before he goes to bed, to kind of put everything on the map. And the more control you have over these, the more you're able to relax these between contractions. And obviously, Gabriel is very talented, but it's certainly assisted. He said it has helped him a lot. So when Vershansky says, come at your question, relax, he literally means to let go of everything and get used to the skill of relaxing muscles.
The interesting thing as well, when you look at it at a molecular level, that kind of power stroke, that actin and myosin interplay, right? You use energy. ATP is used to release muscle and to relax muscle, not to contract it. So like the main energy usage, or the main like expenditure when you're exercising and lifting weights or sprinting or whatever, is in the relaxation phase. So it's in the leaving go of the muscle tissue before you contract again. Like it's the resetting of muscle is very, very costly in terms of energy usage. So obviously being better at that is going to make you a much, much better athlete. So it's a very good question.
Very interesting question.
Late pate, or is it latte pate?
I think it's late pate, because latte is 2 T's, isn't it?
Yeah. It says, what do you think of B stance deadlifts? I think they are the biggest load of horse crap you could ever do. I honestly, and it's funny, you see loads of people doing them in some cases, right? In an injury rehabilitation context. So a B stance deadlift is where you like tuck one foot in behind the other, and you're kind of doing a single leg stance where your one foot is doing most of the work, but the other foot is still on the ground, or like the toe of the other foot is still on the ground. In most cases, training single leg or training isometric work like this is not good. It's not the best way to do it, right? So if I take, for example, B stance deadlift or B stance RDL, what I'm going to do in that stacking of the other leg behind me, or that kind of limp leg that's standing there, what that usually initiates that is a slight hip tilt. So it's the raising, say if it's my left leg is behind, it's the raising of that left hip. I then get a different kind of muscular contraction pattern in my right side. So it's not that I'm just training my right leg. It's not like I'm strapped into a chair and I'm just training the right leg or the right hamstring or the right side of my body. Like I just end up training my whole body. It's just most of the force is being applied to my right leg. So I think in almost all contexts, they are non-beneficial for training. There's better ways to do single leg deadlifts. There's better ways to do single leg RDLs. If you see someone pressing overhead with a B stance, throw a barbell at them or a plate at them and tell them to leave your gym or wherever you're training. Because they are, I don't know where it came from. That came from like 90s pop culture where people were wearing like the spandex and the headbands. Like it's just, no, leave it out. We don't want to see it, and neither do you.
And Deb says, now that you're at it full time for a while, how do you find managing your time and work schedules being self-employed? Do you try to stick to something traditional, or do you find you're working every day? I'd say most weeks we're probably looking at like 6 days a week. Usually nothing on Sundays, but there might be something looked at on Sundays, or someone looking at something in terms of time. I suppose just to kind of do what needs to be done.
Yeah,
in reality,
it's almost impossible to calculate time, because it's like everything we do is on here or on phones, and you always have your phone on you, and most of the time you have your laptop on you as well.
It's a year on the 30th of September, funnily enough, so 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, so 54 weeks.
A year and 2 weeks.
It's a good question, though. I don't really think about it too much. How not to lift at 6'9", James Me says. What do you think of Platz squat? Where you elevate your heel by around 4 inches and your knee stays well over your toes the whole squat. Is this a good way to correct hip dominance? I just call those heels raised squats. I like them. I think there's better ways of training just purely quad strength. But for people who have restricted ankle mobility, they work quite well. I think 4 inches is excessive. Obviously, you're very tall, James, 6'9". But I would prefer like 1.5 to 2 inches is probably going to be much, much more acceptable in terms of how much of a raise you need. Like when you look at most of your weightlifting shoes, you're looking at half inch, 3/4 of an inch, or 1 inch heel raises. Very, very rarely will you get something like an 1.25 inch heel in a weightlifting shoe, like even the Anthems and stuff, which are quite high, are 1 inch raises. So 4 inches is probably a bit too much, but like 2 inches is probably plenty. Like a fraction plate or 2 fraction plates is usually loads. Getting your knees out in front, staying very toes forward, knees forward, definitely is a good way to go about it. I prefer if you're doing those with a belt squat than with a kettlebell or something like that. Certainly than with a barbell. So I would go like belt squat number 1, kettlebell squat in that position number 2, kettlebell kind of deadlift where you're holding the kettlebell down there number 3, and then some sort of barbell or dumbbell loaded one after that would probably be the best.
Dubstep IRL says, lads, I need advice for little to no ankle mobility if I want to keep strength training. I want to keep strength training rugby, but there's a large thing keeping me back. How can I improve ankle mobility? So I just sent the link to Squat University's. He's got 3 different exercises, I think, for ankle mobility. The main thing with ankle mobility is frequent, often, and as much tension.
Aggressive.
As much tension as you can put through it without obviously aggravating the tendon or being incredibly uncomfortable. So frequency, often, and as much passion as you can put into that ankle stretch as possible when you're doing them. So I just sent the video. They explain a lot better. I would do it almost every day if I was you, Dubstep IRL, and get on top of it. And once you get on top of it, you just kind of maintain it. It'll be a lot easier, but you just need to get over the initial hump of trying to get back some ankle mobility.
Jason Thompson says...
Wait, you skipped loads there. Oh.
I didn't. Oh, sorry. Ali...
Rosie says, if one is trying to get in some liquid simple carbs just for workout or during, is Coke a viable option?
No.
I don't think Coke's a liquid. That was a powder.
No, the issue with Coke is the carbonation. Like, what you're looking for in simple carbohydrates when you're taking something on board is, first you want it to be very, very easy on the stomach. So carbonation kind of goes out immediately. And the second thing you're looking at is for it to be an isotonic mixture. So isotonic is the ratio of salt and sugars to water. It's basically like how dense that solution is. So even in specific sports drinks like Lucozade Sport, Gatorade, and stuff like that, you'll have certain ones will be isotonic, and then certain ones will actually be a small bit too concentrated to be isotonic mixtures. Isotonic matters it matters because you can absorb it faster if it is isotonic, and it's much, much slower to absorb it if not. So Coke mixed with water and then shook, so the carbonation is pretty much gone out of it, would probably work quite well, but it would taste like ass. You would be much better off to get something like a simple carbohydrates powder and mix it with water, or you could do something like a Gatorade or Powerade, probably a 30% Powerade or Gatorade to 70% water would probably get you in around there. Just look up the isotonic concentration levels, and then you can work it out off that. I would say well away from Coke, though.
What kind of Coke? What kind of Coke are you talking about?
Jason Thompson says, just been seriously ill for the first time in a while. What's the best way to get back to training? Well, Jason, I'm going to assume you're a weightlifter due to the fact that a lot of people here are weightlifters. The best way to get back to training is to seek a strength return to training weightlifting program. Quick little selfless plug there. But that is the best way to get back. It was written in the last 12 months. It was written purely for people getting back to the gym after prolonged periods where they weren't training due to being out of the gym with COVID or being sick with COVID itself.
Jesus Christ.
Didn't say that.
Stop saying, you can't say that. Like,
but anyway.
This is why YouTube wouldn't prompt us in now, because you keep saying that word. Like.
Definitely not. Anyway, that's the best way to do it. If you want general kind of recommendations, start below 50% of 1 rep max. Start with rep ranges of 8 to 12 reps on everything bar your snatch and clean and jerk.
Lots of mobility.
Loads of mobility work, and then loads of your kind of classic prehab work. So if you know there's injury areas or areas that kind of get lit up frequently, if you have a weak back, if you have weak knees, sore wrists, start hitting those immediately before they ever start to get sore, and kind of preempt those issues that are going to come back. But selfish, shameless plug. Go get the Return to Training weightlifting program.
Wido says, probably quite hard to explain briefly, but if you could touch on how to go about periodizing out training, that'd be unreal. So you can kind of explain this briefly if you leave out all the nuance, but periodization, the whole concept is to get your athletes from a detrained state or a lower state of performance up to a very specific state of performance at a very specific time frame within 5 days of competition or within like a 5-day period. And you want to go from this state here where you're detrained or in a less good performance position to this final state here. Now there is what you can imagine a sideways triangle here almost. Periodization starts with the concept, or it forms the concept that you can only add so much load beyond the previous couple of days or previous week of loading. You can only progress so much between each one of these phases. And so you also want to have a general state of what's known as fitness. Now, when you talk about periodization for athletes, we don't mean just aerobic fitness, as in that lad is pretty fit. We mean in general states of fitness. So we mean things like basic jumping ability. We do mean some cardiovascular ability. We mean some basic skills. We mean a little bit of hypertrophy work. We mean a little bit of just general athleticism stuff done. So you start off real basic here at the bottom of your periodization triangle, and then you gradually get way more specific. So you start off very, very not specific to that athlete sport. You build up a general base at the bottom for your pyramid. And then you add a little bit more specificity, a little bit more loading, lose some of your de-specificity or non-specific work, specific work. And then you go a little bit more specific and you get more specific until eventually you discard all your non-specific work from your pyramid or your programming tree. And then you eventually end up just practicing your sport or as much of your sport as possible while still doing some of your other work. And then you peak for your competition, hopefully. Simple in practice, but very, very difficult for athletes and coaches around the world to get right, as you see all the time with athletes across numerous different sports having terrible performances. The issue with periodization is that you need to force certain levels of fatigue to force some adaptation. However, to peak for your performance, you need to reduce these levels of fatigue to let the adaptation build up. However, if you're not doing enough fatigue, eventually this performance levels decay over time. And so there is an intersection point here between those three different variables, between performance, peaking, and your fatigue, where if you let too much volume in training go, your fatigue will dissipate, but also your performance will dissipate too far below where you want it to be for competition, and you'll end up overshooting your performance, I suppose, through under recovery or under training. And at a certain point, then you'll end up in a destrained state, and you end up back at the bottom of your triangle, and then you end up in a place where you are start all over again.
If you wanted a bit of an analogy, fucking Christ, I'm after getting verbal dyslexia from you.
Are you doing
analogy?
A car analogy?
No, not a car analogy this time. If you want an analogy for an overview of what periodized training looks like, if you were painting a picture, right, and you were painting a smiley face on a background, initially you paint the background, so you paint the whole canvas with the background. Next thing you would do the yellow circle of the smiley face, so it's a smaller amount of the canvas again. Then you will do the black circles for the eyes, black line for the mouth, maybe a black outline, smaller amount of the canvas again. And then you might do like white marker for your highlights, right? your training volume, as Gerf was describing it there, where you accumulate a lot of volume that's probably going to be detrimental to sport-specific work, must be very, very large in the bottom, and then it must taper in towards the top. And I think if you were to look at the vast amount of periodized programs across the world, and you'd look at the main issues they have, is a lot of the time they don't start broad enough. They don't accumulate enough volume in that broad, low specificity area, and they go too specific too early. So I think that would, your explanation would probably be as rigid as you need it.
Painting cars. Like.
Yeah. Liam M has a question then. He goes, what should I eat the day before and the day of a rugby match? Is there a certain amount of calories to hit? For reference, the match is at 2:30 in the afternoon. I'm 6'3" and 105 kilos. So the first thing here you need to look at is what's your daily calorie intake like normally. I would assume if you're 6'3" and 105 kilos playing rugby, you are at between 2,800 and 3,000 calories per day, depending what level you're at and how often you're training. So that's the first thing. Caloric intake stays pretty much the same the day of the game and the day before the game. You don't change that. Then what you need to look at is you need to look at macronutrients, and you need to look at timing of those macronutrients. So if we look at the day before the match, firstly, you want to carb load as aggressively as you possibly can. You want to be getting the highest proportion possible of your calories from carbohydrates the day before and the day of the match. Most of the time, if you're looking for that, you're looking for those big boluses of carbohydrate to be in the middle of the afternoon and in the early evening. So you have a long time before you go to bed. You're not eating a lot of food just before you go to bed and kicking off that digestive system and then jeopardizing your sleep. And then the day of the game, you're looking at probably 2 hours before having your main meal. If you're taking stimulants or if you're taking some other supplements, that might change around slightly. But usually you wake up at the normal time, the same time we wake up every day. You have your normal breakfast, the same breakfast you eat every day, unless that breakfast you eat every day is very heavy and fat. So if you eat bacon and eggs every morning, then you shouldn't be eating that on game day, right? You might need to change out the bacon. You could probably still keep the eggs in there, but ideally something like porridge, Weetabix, something higher in carbohydrates for your breakfast. The other rule you need to look at is don't change anything drastically. So obviously we don't want really high fat foods in the kind of 24 hours before the game because we want to prioritize carbohydrate as much as possible. Rugby is a heavily glycolytic and creatine phosphate system sport. So those energy systems are the things we really need to be supporting with our diet the day before and the day of. So keep your fats quite low. Try and get the majority of your calories from carbohydrates, and then don't change the food intake in terms of the foods you eat. If you never eat Quest protein bars, don't eat Quest protein bars the day before or the day of the game. Eat things you eat all the time, whether that's Cocoa Pops, whether that's Weetabix, whatever it is. Don't go changing stuff randomly on the day of the game because you think it'll make things better.
What's that song? Don't go chasing
waterfalls.
That's it.
Stick to the rivers and the streams that you're used to. Rivers and the lakes.
Who's that? Coldplay? No, that was Coldplay. Don't Patrol.
No, maybe Snow Patrol.
Don't go chasing. Don't go chasing waterfalls. That was TLC.
No
Holy
way.
Fuck.
What a song.
Jesus Christ. Bastille does a great rendition of No Scrubs. It's called No Angels.
No way.
It's so good. It's so good.
Okay, Meathead Snatch wants to know what Sika Stan's national anthem is. It's a minute and a half of uninterrupted silence.
Just aggressive silence.
Just aggressive silence.
Palms turned out.
Anatomical position.
Yeah.
Palms turned out.
The Vesuvian Man.
Yeah, just standing there like that is the national anthem.
Yeah.
If we were to have like a national happy person song, it would be Wolves Down the Earth by Gojira, I think. That would be like for celebrations only, though.
Only celebrations.
Yeah.
Which we never did.
Okay. Alex Arquila says,
aggressive silence.
just want to thank you, lads, for all the information you've given out last year. Oh, thanks very much, Alex. It's really hit me with some solid, get me back to a solid training year and hit some PRs in my upcoming competition. Thanks very much, Alex. Alex, you're a very regular commenter.
Yeah.
And we really do appreciate it. Most of these names are names we see every week, which is absolutely brilliant to see. And we really do appreciate it.
Like GRK Stud 97.
Yeah.
Who says, does regular using PAP elicit better gains long term? or is it something that only has relevance short term? So as of yet, we haven't seen any good long-term studies or longitudinal, as they would kind of call it in the literature, where someone has routinely used PAP in their training over a meaningful period of time with meaningful exercises, with meaningful athletes in a position where you
feel like you're really digging in on meaningful,
where it's something useful. So we haven't seen it yet. I feel like there's a certain band of time, kind of like when we're talking about small off, where you need to do that volume for a long period of time or take enough drugs for that long period of time, where you will keep those gains or maintain or solidify the progress you've made. So I think there's an amount of PAP training where you would likely see enough, or you would likely see some gains from using PAP, but haven't really seen anyone produce any studies yet. And I don't know if anyone will be doing it, to be honest, because that is a hard study to do in terms of not the science of the study. It's a hard study to do to get people to come into you for, like realistically, you'd want something like for 8 weeks or more. Ideally, be something like realistically a 12-week training block where you get like 30 to 50 quality athletes who'd come into you 3 to 4 times a week, or maybe even twice a week. You control all the things they do. You'd make sure they're not doing anything else for 12 weeks, which would be so hard. Because if they're good athletes, they might be professional athletes, they might be collegiate athletes. They are, if they're not collegiate athletes, they're probably motivated athletes in their own right. So sacrificing 12 weeks of training for you probably isn't something they're going to do. If they're motivated, they're probably a little bit neurotic about their training, so they're not going to come in and sacrifice 12 weeks of training for you. So it'll be so hard to get a kind of study like that done. Really, what you need is good old Soviet days where you can just make athletes and sacrifice them for the good of everyone else and the good of sports science.
The greater good.
The greater good 40 years later. So you just get a position where you just don't see people doing PAP studies like that. And I'd love to see one. It'd be very, very interesting to see. But I don't think we'll see it any time in the future. I'm sure they might. China does a shitload of sports science studies, and you do see them in the papers. There might be someone out in Ether there with their athletes that might have done something like that. PAP wasn't really a thing during the Soviet era, so we haven't really seen any of that. It could be there for sure, but we haven't seen it. So for multiple reasons, multiple just practical reasons, not scientific or lack of desire, I don't know if we'll see a long-term PAP training intervention study done with enough controls, enough quality athletes before we'll see any kind of meaningful studies. And to be honest, I don't know anyone who uses PAP in their training as it is. So we don't even get anecdotal evidence. I don't know anyone. I don't know any quality athletes who use it.
To be honest, as well, if you look at what PAP is similar to, right? So PAP would be similar to using a slingshot for benching and benching heavier than you're able to bench, and using that over a prolonged period, 4 to 6 months of training, and you don't see any increase in 1 RM bench press strength after that, or same as doing super maximal front rack holds, make your front squat better, or whatever. Anytime you get excessive facilitation of super maximal weights, it almost never works out positively, right? There's a host of cases where you used to see people using this, and it would be like training your squat in a squat suit for 8 months and expecting just because you were lifting heavier weights with the use of a squat suit that you're now going to be able to lift heavier weights without the squat suit. A lot of that facilitative loading doesn't work out. Now, it is important to note as well that like there is the opposite true in certain training applications, particularly in speed training applications at body weight or less. So sprinting, jumping, vertical jumps, long jumps, triple jumps, the use of super maximal speed in those cases is very, very beneficial. That's why you'll see people running on very, very sped up treadmills where they're really having to work hard. They're not moving their own body mass. They're just working hard to move their legs as fast as possible. So there might be a case in that case, but it doesn't seem to be true with strength training to this point, where this kind of drastic overreaching or overestimation of your own strength through the use of some sort of facilitator. I don't think, just looking at it theoretically, I don't think it's going to be the next big thing.
What someone might see something is if they look at the muscle physiology, or is there any effects over a shorter period of time on people after using PAP, and it might be a way of seeing then, would you see better responses And I'm sure someone might have done that, but I don't think we've come across one yet. Just speaking of gear powerlifting, I still don't understand this after all these years. It still doesn't make sense to me. From day one,
No.
like 15 years ago at this stage, on Elite FTS, just seeing equipped powerlifting.
Yeah.
And they're like squatting 1,000 kilos, but it just didn't make sense to me. It just made no sense.
Yeah.
Like
I remember having so it was in some magazine, it might have been one of the rugby magazines, and there was like a guy doing 1,000 pounds for a few reps, I think, on a squat or something like that.
Yeah.
And I just remember being so baffled and thrown away by it, like blown away. And then watching videos of people squatting like 250 kilos.
Yeah.
And then being like, oh, it's obviously something completely different.
I remember Jim Wendler talking about he wants to squat 1,000 pounds, but he said if he ever got so fat he had to walk for exercise that he'd just kill himself. And then he eventually ended up having to walk for exercise.
Yeah.
But he squatted 1,000 pounds. But I mean, I don't know. They're very defensive of it too, you know.
Oh, so defensive.
Which is fair enough, I suppose. Like, because
it
takes so much gear and have to do so much work, and the training is so much hassle, and you have to get the lads to put you into your squat suit.
And you really do
fuck up your body too.
Fuck up your life.
Yeah, and your
besides just you fuck up everything.
Mark Bell was talking about that they didn't know how much gear they were taking. You should take just 2 full syringes into the shoulder like twice a week or something, which
the glory days.
That's the level of gear you should aspire to use, really.
That's also why so many of them aren't around anymore.
Still training, like?
No, aren't alive anymore.
A lot of them are still alive. Mark Bell's in great shape, and
Mark Bell's in great shape. Mark Bell is a fucking millionaire.
I know, like there's
a lot of those lads have died.
Have they? Yeah. No, but that's because they were fucking like
coke addicts as well.
Oh yeah. Those West Side dudes. No, a lot of there's Matt Wenning still alive. And that's all the names. Okay. Dave Tate's still alive.
DM Hunter 15 says, is there any point in me doing 2 days if I have no competition hopes in the near future? DM, I'd love to know if you're a weightlifter or not. Just pop a comment in there quickly if you are. I'm going to assume you're a weightlifter, and I'm going to say, no, there's no point in you doing 2 days.
Jim Wendler's still alive.
I'm going to say there's no point in you doing 2 days right now if you don't have a competition coming up. So what you have to look at is, firstly, why would it be beneficial to do 2 days? So usually people, 2 days have higher frequency, higher overall training volume. All these positive things come into their head. They're training harder, getting more reps done, getting more reps at relatively high percentages done. And all these things are definitely important. But when you look at the reality of 2-a-day trainings, almost none of that holds true. So for most male athletes, particularly male natural athletes or clean athletes, not saying you fall into that category, but you're going to realistically do very, very little overall volume in terms of meaningful actual volume that's beneficial to weightlifting. So you'll get more overall volume in terms of like air squats at body weight, midline stability work, all this stuff done because you get an extra 100% of warm-up stuff done. You get some extra strength training or accessory work training done because usually you'll do some of that in both of those sessions every day. So you might get an extra 15 to 20% of total volume on those. When you look at the lifts though, it's very unlikely you'll do snatch and clean and jerk twice a day unless you're in some like a Bulgarian system or a Romanian system or whatever it is where you have a full-time coach with you and they're training you and they're bringing you through a snatch and clean and jerk session twice a day. Even if you are in that kind of system, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to be lifting weights that mean something. So weights that aren't just 60%, 70% of one around that you're kind of just getting through the numbers. It's very unlikely also that you'll be doing enough volume in those sessions to bring about meaningful change. So we think about weightlifting sessions, a lot of the time where people go wrong is they just do a top single or a top double or a top triple, and their total number of meaningful sets over the course of the week is crap. When you need to be doing multiple sets at a working weight, multiple sets at a certain volume over the course of the week. And when you do multiple sessions per day, we tend to water that down even further. So you're like, oh, I'm coming into these snatches later, so I'll just do one double here of power snatch, or I'll just do one triple of power snatch, and then I'll do the rest of my snatch work later on. In reality, you're better to go to the gym. You're better to session to last less than 2 hours and try and get a really, really intense, meaningful session done once a day, 4 to 5 times a week.
You know, when when I obviously got involved, I didn't know what gear was. So it'd be
Yeah.
like, the lads would be like massive, you know, and they'd be like, oh, journeys being ripped or whatever, and they'd lose like a load of weight and they'd be fucking
Yeah.
And you didn't know even gear was a thing. Like,
Yeah.
so I was still in secondary school, like, I just
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah,
even
yeah.
aware, like, it didn't even enter my head that I'd be like, oh, like, Dave Tate's doing on gear here.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember who else there was, but who look? Sure look. GRK Stud says, what do you think about AI supported training programs? There's only one company I know of doing those, and there's no reason an AI program wouldn't work, but I don't know anything about this specific one. So
yeah, I only know of the Juggernaut AI system, and I don't know anyone who's run it. So I'd love to talk shit about some program that I'd seen, but
yes,
I can't. It would be unfair for us to do it for Juggernaut, and it would also be unfair to you guys because we'd just be spouting shite at you that we don't know anything about.
The only thing with AI programs is you would have to have very definitive rules about how training would work, and obviously they're not fully laid out yet, and it's based on a coach's intuition and learning and experience. So it would be difficult, I'd imagine. But I've only heard of one or two people running the Juggernaut AI one, and I didn't hear any bad about it, but I didn't hear anything great about it. They said it was just kind of. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't really have any opinions on it. There doesn't seem to be many of it there yet, and for good reason, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, Christian Fagan has a question, right? And it's a good question. What makes some axially loaded lifts okay for twice a week, so jerks and squats, versus once a week or less for deadlifts? Is it raw tonnage or just a feeling thing? So there's a few things that go in here, right? The first thing you have to talk about is raw tonnage. The actual weight that's on the bar makes a gigantic difference, right? So 1 rep max deadlift will fatigue your CNS in a way a strict press will never ever be able to fatigue it, due to the fact that it's probably around 30% of your deadlift. It's just never going to fatigue you as much. Now, there are other things at play. Certainly the volume you're doing every week in those lifts is going to be very different. The volume of the jerk will never be as high as the volume for the squat in most amateur training circumstances, right? So with most amateurs, you're training your squat probably like a 5x5, 3x5, 4 or 3x8, 8x3, whatever it is. Most of the time, the volume is somewhere relatively high, and the jerk is simply never getting up that high. Now, with the jerk, there's obviously things like the amount of frequency you do every week. Why you're able to do that frequency much higher is also down to the fact that if you have eccentric and concentric and an amortization phase during a lift, it's going to fatigue your muscle tissue an awful lot more. So if I have an eccentric phase of a lift, it's going to do way more damage to the muscle tissue than if I just have a concentric phase. So concentric is just shortening of the muscle under tension. So that will be standing up from the squat, pulling the barbell up off the ground, driving the barbell up overhead. All of these things are shortening muscle groups under tension. If I have an eccentric, which is elongation of a muscle under tension, so as I sit down into a squat, as I lower a deadlift back down to the floor, the elongation period, it does way more damage to muscle tissue. So in terms of micro tears, in terms of loading of the tendons, that is much more impactful in terms of recovery. So you're obviously not going to be able to train that as much during the week.
Thomas Wright says, is there any benefit of protracting the scapula and pressing movements as a combat athlete? No, there's no benefit to anyone trying to do anything with your scapula and a pressing movement. So any interaction you'll do with your mid back or your upper back or whatever, the pressing movements just wouldn't make sense in terms of pressing, because they do contract and elongate during the whole pressing movement. So it wouldn't make any sense trying to put these in any particular position. So just make sure you're rigid, you're tight, and you're pressing appropriately, and you have direct mobility. But I wouldn't be concerned about your scapula in pressing, combat or otherwise.
That's for a lot of people. That falls into the case of reading into things a bit too much. Like if you're worried about where your baby toe is putting pressure on during the squat, or where the feeling of tension in your hamstring is during the deadlift, whether it's lateral or medial, you're just paying far too much attention to things that don't really matter With the pressing movements, you just press it. You get better at pressing. You get a stronger press, and you'll be a much better athlete overall after 6 or 8 or 12 months or 4 years than you will be about wearing where your scapular position. Okay, Jamil Kouara says, is the Nordic hamstring curl the best way to develop hammies and glutes when dealing with an SI joint tear and lower back pain? Jeez, that sounds painful.
Fucking hell.
Right. Why Nordic hamstring curls are so good, why quad Nordics are so good. You get excessive loading during the eccentric phase, just as we spoke about 3 minutes ago. So the eccentric phase of the movement is where we do the most damage to the muscle tissue. It's where we can bring about the most change in the contractile tissue. And it's the most beneficial for bringing about actual adaptation. Now, there's a whole host of other adaptations we need to bring about to make a good athlete. So like it won't make you faster, it won't give you better proprioceptive awareness, it won't bring about all those neurological changes. But when you look at getting thick, juicy hamstrings and glutes, you need to be putting those little tears in that tissue and inducing hypertrophy in that muscle. And very heavily loaded eccentrics are perfect for that. So I would say Nordic hamstring curls are very good. The one caveat I would have to that is, the other thing that matters a lot, besides it having a very heavily loaded eccentric phase, is that you do enough volume. And unfortunately, a lot of us with our Nordic hamstring curls won't be able to accrue a huge amount of volume due to the fact your hamstrings, your glutes, your erectors, all of these might be quite weak. So you might only be able to do 3 reps or 5 reps of perfect form. And after 5 or 6 sets, you might start to break down. In that case, do your Nordic hamstring curls. Do those as best you can with good quality reps for the start of the session, and then go on to something like banded hamstring curl, cable hamstring curl, machine hamstring curl, and get jacked up and get the best pump you possibly can following your kind of higher load exercise.
Where's that? West at or we stat 7 says thoughts on knees over toe guy. So my first thought is his crest, his wave has slightly peaked off at the moment, which is interesting how people are like in and then it's gone again, like Instagram. I don't see much on Instagram anymore. There was talks of being on Rogan, which I don't know will happen. It'd be interesting if it did happen. So I think the thing with knees over toes guy, right, is for the demographic of you guys watching is that you would have gotten all of the benefits that knees over toes guy stuff would do realistically, because the main thing with knees over toes guy stuff was just promoting knees over toes. But all of these movements are like single leg stuff or full range of motion, which is most of the people watching our stuff here would already probably doing that. So your knee issues aren't going to be solved by doing full range of motion stuff or having any particular single leg work that he does. Like none of them are particularly bad exercises, but there's nothing special about what he does because you are already doing a lot of that. So when you see, I think, a lot of those anecdotal evidence of people being like, oh, I did his stuff and it was phenomenal, it's probably because they didn't do a lot of full range of motion with squatting already, didn't do a lot of single range of motion squatting already, and thus they didn't have that requisite mobility or stability in that new range of motion that they never did before. So anytime they went into that was in an adverse situation, and that's probably why they're experiencing pain. So they started doing full range of motion of single legs work, and then they magically felt a lot better. But in reality, a lot of you guys already do that stuff. So apart from the tibia raises, which I think are quite interesting, everything else is probably something you're already going to be able to do, or it's already stuff you will be doing or have tried to do, so probably won't help your stuff. Do I think he has sold himself very well? I think so. Do I think he's disingenuous? I don't think so. I think he has genuinely come to this realization in his head, whether he realizes it or not, why it's working. It seems to be helping people, so I don't think it's going to make people worse. They talk about not doing things if it doesn't aggravate your injury. So I'm kind of like, okay, whatever. I don't really have any, I don't really have any feelings towards him in terms of an emotional point of view. I wouldn't say don't do his stuff. I would just say power ahead, really, I suppose, if you want to try it. I don't think it's going to hurt you. But But I think that's where a lot of the benefits are coming from people being like, my God, it works so well. I mean, it was just restoration of full range of the motion through like progressive movements, which I don't know, listening to him talk, I don't know if he realizes that's why it's working, as opposed to some magical strongest knees in the game kind of thing. If you want to ask me honestly, that's my opinion.
I don't think I've watched one of his videos, so same kind of thing. I can't really comment. They use supplementing grip.
Yeah,
right. Thomas Clark says, "Hi guys, any thoughts on clicking knees?" So Thomas, to firstly preface this with the usual kind of injury disclaimer, right? Myself and Gareth aren't healthcare professionals, so we're not going to be able to tell you anything about an injury. But
I'm more than half a doctor. Like,
we'll briefly talk about knees clicking. Like, so he said, both my knees click every time I squat. It is painless, but a bit disconcerting, and I have a lot of concerned looks at the gym. Thanks. So when we look at knees clicking, right, there's a lot of shit out there where people are like, it's air or gas escaping from your knee joint, or
it is. It makes perfect sense.
So when you have a knee, you have bottom of the leg, femur on top, and then you have a kneecap in the middle. Most of that extension in the knee is controlled by this patellar tendon attaching onto this little plate of bone, and that plate of bone attaching onto a quadriceps tendon at the top. A lot of the time, what we get when we have clicking in the knee is we have this little plate of bone, so this bottle cap here, and that little plate of bone is slightly just off center, and we have either quadriceps or the patellar tendon slipping over one of the bony processes, and we get this clicking or cracking in the knee. The clicking itself isn't necessarily an issue. As you said, it's painless. It's probably not going to cause an issue. What it might be an issue, though, is the fact that it could be symptomatic of misalignment of your quads. So your quad, as you know, it's called quad, is made up of 4 different muscles. Your vastus lateralis on the very outside of the quad, your rectus femoris up near your hip flexor, your vastus intermedialis, and then your vastus medialis on the outside. A lot of the time, the vastus medialis, which is like a teardrop shape on the inside of your quad, on Girth's quads, it looks like an elephant's testicle. A lot of the time, you have underdevelopment of the vastus medialis and you've overdevelopment of vastus lateralis, and you're getting a lateral pull on that patella, that kneecap, whatever it is, right? That clicking is because of that lateral pull and that slight misalignment of these top or these upper and lower kind of system of tendons, and that might be symptomatic of a problem possibly presenting later in the future, right? So it's symptomatic of tighter quads. It's symptomatic of this imbalance between lateral and medial loading in the quads. So I would look at it, and I would look at stretching my quads. I'd look at developing my quads and make my quads stronger, and then developing it towards a point where your quads don't click. It's not necessarily an issue. You've very likely spoken to a coach or a physiotherapist who told you it isn't an issue, but it could just be symptomatic of something that may be an issue in the future if you keep training and it keeps getting worse.
So the other thing it could be is it spoils on, that hooks on my head, is that so in the pocket inside your joint where your synovial fluid is, so the fluids in there are under a certain amount of pressure when your knee is at a certain state. And so there is particular gases dissolved in the synovial fluid. So there's like nitrogen and oxygen. And when you change the movement, when you move your knee, you're changing 2 variables that influence gases, which boils off, so pressure and temperature. And so when you change the pressure and temperature, these gases may dissolve or evaporate from the synovial fluid, form a gas, and then once you change back the pressure and finish the movement, it may change the pressure again, force them to dissolve, and you get this cracking. I don't know if anyone has kind of investigated that wholly. It could be a combination of things. That is a legitimate possibility. Interesting enough, there was a gentleman who cracked all the knuckles in one hand and not the other for most of his life. He ended up to see if he'd get arthritis, and he got a Nobel Prize for that, and he didn't get an arthritis. That was the case. I'd have arthritis my neck by now.
Okay. Dentistry 1, we'll answer your question, then we'll just cherry pick a few off the end. A question about pin squats. Is it okay to do touch and go, or is it better to touch the pin fully and breathe in and out and go up again? Neither of those are right. So you don't want to do touch and go, because obviously banging steel to steel and getting that kind of elastic reaction at the bottom is non-ideal for training. It'll probably throw you out of position slightly, and it will fuck up your barbell or whoever's barbell you're using. You also don't want to breathe in and breathe out fully, or breathe out and then breathe in fully and go again, which is probably more likely the case, due to the fact that you're going to lose midline stability. You're going to lose tension, particularly around your lower and mid back, which is the last thing you want to do. Do we have our little stick man? So as you sit down into the bottom of your squat, if you imagine, geez, he's really lacking some mobility. So imagine this is the bottom of your squat. When you're at the top and you breathe it in fully, we'll do an overhead squat. When you breathe it in fully, this kind of midline here is full of air, and that tension and all the contractile tissue in your midline is contracted around your diaphragm. It's contracted around that air that's sitting inside your lungs, whether that's a full breath of air or a half breath of air. When you then come down here, that's obviously contracted harder and you get more tension down in here if you're bracing correctly. If you were then to breathe out and breathe back in again, you're breathing back into a constricted area and you're not going to have the same level of tension. So then as you go to stand up, you'll have a very, very compromised ability to brace and ability to maintain a good midline. So that is something you really, really need to be cognizant of. You shouldn't be breathing out and breathing back in at the bottom of a squat. What would be better to do? You take your big breath in at the top, you sit all the way down until the barbell just barely taps that steel. Imagine there's 2 eggs underneath the barbell on each side, so it barely taps the steel, and then you come up again. That's the level of contact you want to be making on those. Just barely contacting. Put a piece of like toilet roll or tissue on the thing, and you should just barely be touching that and coming up. You shouldn't be breaking the toilet roll by the end of your 5 or 6 sets of squats. Oh yeah, you shouldn't be doing pin squats. I don't know why you are.
Rufus said that I'm getting crazy dreams.
I saw that.
Okay, so they make the Belfast. So do you use session? So SRPE is session, RPE. We don't use RPE at all. Just if you want to use a session, you just say, how did the session feel? And then the athlete will tell you the truth and say, I have to rest half an hour after the lunges because my legs are tired. Stuff like that. But we don't put a rating on it. So just get them to tell us some information. Here's the last question for today. So Wido says, is there any use going ATG on squats for rugby, particularly given players rarely end up in that lower position in rugby? My concern is it adds more fatigue, but has little benefit to my game. So my answer to this is opposite what Fitz is going to say, but my answer is the same as what Fitz does with these rugby players. So while Fitz wants to say it, they're not useful, what he ends up using for his athletes is actually full depth squats. It only makes sense, right? So for me, if you look at where you end up in rugby, it's a lot of compromised positions. And so you want to be assured that you're resilient in those positions. You want to make sure that your tendons go through a full range of motion as possible. So you develop correct integrity with those. You develop them to the best strength as possible. You get more out of squats in relation to overall kind of strength and power if you do them to a full depth, so full range of motion. You can use less weight in training, which will give you a bigger benefit to those. And in general, full depth squats just look much better for most people, in my opinion.
In published literature, everything would say squats to parallel or squats above parallel. What you need to be training for sprinters, power athletes, rugby players, in cases like that. As Gerf correctly pointed out, for most of my athletes, most of my rugby athletes in particular, they are very, very accomplished squatters. You people squatting 240 kilos for reps at really, really good body compositions. These are people who are bullshit strong. You female rugby players doing 140 kilo squats. Like, these are very, very good squatters. And it just so happens that my rugby players and the rugby players I have right now are good squatters, right? So that's why Gerf is correctly getting to throw me off my perch on this one. He's dead right. They all squat well. They all squat ass to grass, and they look great. For the most part, someone squatting so the level of their ass comes to the height of their knee for rugby, for power sports, for sprinting is absolutely more than beneficial. It's obviously going to let them lift much heavier weights and progress much faster to lifting heavier weights, which is the main reason you want to be doing it. Why though? To answer your question, if you're good at squatting, keep squatting well and keep trying to make your squat better. If you're not good at squatting, if you do not have a 2 times or 2.5 times body weight squat, then you just need to get stronger at squatting. The weight on the bar at the end of the day is the most important thing, and you need to make that weight much, much bigger than what it currently is, unless it's 2 or 2.5 times body weight. Okay, 2 things here. First thing, DM Hunter, right? He's saying he's a weightlifter, and he was saying to split up his session earlier. He's asking about 2 days. Mental acuity's sake, he wants to split up the sessions because they're taking too long. The 2 days are the last thing you need to do. They're the very, very last thing you need to do, because they'll allow you to procrastinate more. They'll allow you to piss around more in the gym, and they'll allow you just to have more of this kind of nothingness time where you're sitting there, or you're on your phone, or you're talking to people, or you're not really concentrating. In the case where mental acuity is an issue, you need to put a time limit on everything. You have to live and die by the timer. Everything written out. If you miss a lift, you just go on, you go again. You never change from the time, and that will get you much better levels of concentration. The last thing you want, if you have an athlete who's struggling with concentration and mental acuity during the sessions, is to elongate and give them more time to do it. Like, if you're struggling to get everything in, you need to be better with your timing, have a higher work capacity, and it'll be much more beneficial. Dennis there wants to know why we don't think pin squats are useful. Because they're not useful. You're taking out one of the most important parts of the squat, as in the amortization phase, which is, as we said earlier, if the eccentric phase is important, the amortization phase is the second most important, and it's a very, very close second. And then the concentric phase is just bringing you back up to the top so you can do the eccentric phase again.
So like, everyone has the same sticking point in high bar squats, and that's just slightly above parallel. Everyone can get there. It's just how limbs are built, because they're all the same, essentially the same human beings with the same levers. But we are.
How dare you?
So everyone has the same issues. If you missed a squat, it's not because you had a sticking point and you were really strong for the rest of the squat, and you were really strong after that sticking point. You just simply were not strong enough to complete the squat, and it is time to just get stronger. If you missed a squat, you had to miss it somewhere. There wasn't a particular point where you would have made it if you hadn't hit that sticking point. You just were not able to make that squat. So rather than wasting time doing pin squats, I would say just do better quality squatting. And thankfully, when we say things like this, not only can we say it in theory, but we just literally seen thousands of athletes get better without doing pin squats. So we're always looking for the most efficient training you can do possibly, and just better quality, better, smarter programming and squats always works better. I've never given someone pin squats. I don't think you have either. I've never used pin squats for myself. I can never think of a time where I've gone, fuck, that person needs pin squats.
No. And if you want, like, we sold our, so we've had our website running for a while. We obviously had the business running for a while after or before that. And we sold over 10,000 programs as of yesterday on the website. That is, all of those people got better without pin squats.
Yeah.
Nobody needs them. They're kiss me ass exercises that allow people to lift more weights than they can actually lift and feel good about it.
I'd say I could do something stupid off pin squats for no.
But I can unrack in the front rack 300 kilos. I'd say I'd be able to pin squat 300 kilos in the front rack.
I'd say I would.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks for your questions, lads.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Some great clips from this as well, which is great.
Oh, Nicholas wants to know when the shoe review and Sika Pants are coming. Sika Pants will be in the next month. We've been asked to hold off the shoe review until the end of the month so they have everything in stock. If people want to buy them, it'll just make everything easier. So, end of the month for the shoe review.
Same for rack pulls, yeah.
Yeah.
Exact same.
Thanks, guys.
Bye for bars.